For your Module 3 on Geometric Design of Highways and Railroads, we will be starting with the discussion of road transportation components in this unit. And in this video, we will identify the different components of road transportation and relate these different components and understand how each of them affect the action of another, or the change in one component affects the other components of road transportation. So in these images, you can see here the different aspects or components that affects the design of our road transport. Some of these components are: first is human. It consists of the driver of the vehicles and the pedestrian. When you say drivers, of course, those are the one that maneuvers your vehicles, and pedestrians are those people that are walking or using road transport by walking. Also have vehicle, the roads and highways, and the environment, which is comprised of the weather, time of the day, and angle of the sun, and a lot more components that affects the environment. Technically, the roads and highways is also part of the environment, which affects the road transportation. The independent interactions between the various components create a complex system in road transportation. So this is really a very complex system, because some of uh, components here are somewhat controllable, but some are really unexpected or unmanageable in that sense, especially the human component. So we will focus on this video on the human component of road transport, because there are many factors that affects this component. So let's start with driver characteristics. The challenge faced by the transportation engineers are the following. Drivers have varying skills and perceptual abilities. So we know that every driver has different skills. Some are professional, some are non-professional, some are just beginners, and they have different perceptual abilities, which is affected by a lot of factors also, by age, by their health, and their stress, their emotional fatigue, for example, affects this their skills at the given time of the given day. Different abilities in hearing, seeing, evaluating, and reacting to a traffic situation. Driver age and old drivers, as I have mentioned a while ago, affected by fatigue, alcohol, and time of the day. So here are some uh, factors that affects the decisions or the perception, the evaluation abilities of each of these driver. Of course, if there's more stress, or you are stressed, for example, or you are under the influence of alcohol, then it will affect your perception, your reaction, your evaluation, your reaction to certain traffic incidents will be affected. We use an average value of the 85th or 90th percentile when we are evaluating these challenges or characteristics. Sensing abilities. This is composed of feeling, seeing, hearing, smelling. The driver receives useful information regarding safe control of the vehicle. So example of this one are pieces of information from the temperature and humidity. You can feel temperature and humidity, especially if your car window is open. Forces, rate of change, vibration, and oscillations of the engine, for example. received through the eyes, ears, and sensory nerve endings. Since these are sensing abilities, we will be using, of course, our sensory nerve endings and our different types of senses. Let's start with feeling. So the driver receives useful information regarding safe control of the vehicle. This is affected by the force of gravity, by acceleration, braking, and acceleration is further divided into braking and deceleration, cornering acceleration, and because we are talking about acceleration, we will be forming or using G as the acceleration due to gravity to describe some other accelerations that is felt by the driver, such as the lateral acceleration. So here are some examples. During a 90-degree turn at 24 kph, experience a 0.3 times G, which is the acceleration due to gravity of lateral acceleration, and 0.10 G of lateral acceleration for long horizontal curve at 97 kph. So those are some of the forces that is felt by the driver while traversing a road. This is derived by moment and equilibrium. When we say equilibrium, that is the sense of balance. Movement, of course, that is sense of moving. Kinesthesia or kinesthetic is the sensation of bodily position, muscles, tendons, and joints. For lateral and longitudinal acceleration, the seats, steering wheel, brake pedal, armrests, seat belts, headrests, these are being some of the factors that is affecting the sensation of these bodily positions of our muscles. Proprioceptors are stimulated by moving or shifting the body. So some racers use this to somewhat alter the acceleration of their vehicle. Provides feedback for the driver to take some other action. So that is the sense of feeling. We have the vestibular, the message received through the vestibular nerve or the inner ear. Three fluid semicircular canals, direction of movement and balance. So combination of these two are kinesthetic and vestibular, which is felt when there is a change of direction, when you are steering the wheel. Braking, there are vibrations, and vehicle stability, especially when you are uh, steering, and some other factors. So let's now move to the seeing part of the human component or the sensing abilities of the drivers. The sense of sight is the most important sense in driving. That's why when you are going to take your driver's license, this is one of the tests that is being done for your medical certificate. 90% of received information is visual. That is why the concentration of our eyes when driving is very important in road transportation, because that will determine whether we will have a greater risk of uh, meeting an accident or causing an accident. You have the foveal or peripheral vision. The foveal images are concentrated in a small area of the eye, while the peripheral vision is the vision outside the center or direct line of action. Visual perception has five principal characteristics, and those are visual acuity, peripheral vision, color vision, glare vision and recovery, and depth perception. We will be going over this in the next slides. So let's start with visual acuity. This is the ability to see fine details of an object clearly. So this is affected by your age, of course, and the health of your eyes. This is represented by a visual angle. We have the static or stationary and dynamic or moving acuity. For static acuity, for 0.5 seconds to 1 second, the optimal time for object identification and the visual factors are held constant. Of course, if you are using your vehicle, you are moving. So there are some stationary objects relative to your position also. So we use static acuity. For dynamic acuity, this is the ability to detect relatively moving objects. If you are traversing a road, for example, and then there are also some other vehicles that is traversing the same road in the same direction or on the opposite direction, that is the perception in that is that you are using dynamic acuity, the ability to detect relatively moving objects, relative, of course, to your motion. Because recalling your dynamics, we say always that motion is relative. The cones of vision. So here, this is the cones of vision. The smaller portion here is your foreal, and the cone away from that is the peripheral vision. This is your eyes and your line of sight or line of vision. The 3 to 5 degree conical angle is very clear. That is the foreal vision, this one. So the radius of this cone is, or the angle of this smaller cone is 3 to 5 degrees. While for the peripheral angle, that would be 10 to 12 or 10 to 12 degrees, because this is 5. You double that, that would be 10 to about 12 degrees for some people. But objects outside 12 degrees or outside these peripheral visions would be blurry. Visual acuity is measured by recognition acuity obtained using standard Snellen chart. Normal vision or the 20/20 vision means that in a well-lit environment, a person can recognize a letter of about 1/3 inch in 20 feet. So this means that if you have a 20/20 vision, you can see a letter that is about 1/3 inch of a height in 20 feet. You're 20 feet away from that writing. So the peripheral vision relates to an individual's ability to see objects not necessarily clearly. This serves as warning signs. Varies between 120 to 180 degrees. The head can move 45 degrees to the right or left and 30 degrees up and down. So since we have this limited head movement, we somewhat use peripheral vision sometimes when looking at objects outside our foreal cone of vision or the line of vision that we have. And once we saw something in our peripheral vision, then we can sometimes we transfer our attention or transfer our line of sight into that specific object. For example, in anticipation of a moving object. For example, if you are driving on in a road and there are some animals that is crossing, then you may use peripheral vision in that case in your driving to detect animals that are crossing those roads. So Here, this is a demonstration of that peripheral vision. Of course, the center or the fixation point will have a clearer uh, acuity, while for the other parts would be blurry. As you go further from the line of vision, as the angle moves away from that, it will be blurry. Next would be color vision. This is the next part in the perception characteristics. The third, actually. The ability to differentiate colors. 8% of all men and 4% of all women suffer from some degree of color blindness. Color blindness is the reduced ability to distinguish between red and green. Not of great significance in highway driving, but is still important to compensate the shape of an object. Black, white, or black, yellow colors are sensitive to the eye. That is why these are being used in our signages. So we have we have here uh, some images wherein you can see an outline of numbers. If you have difficulty in seeing or you have some sort of color blindness, then you will have a difficulty looking at the number that is shown in this figure. So for this one, this is 29. You check if you can see the same. For this one, for the second image here, this is number 74. The fourth part of the of the perception characteristics would be the glare vision and recovery. This is important for during the day and during night. During the day, you will have some problems with glare that is caused by the sun, and during the night, of course, during that will be caused by the headlights of the vehicles that is coming opposite your direction. Glare vision is seeing when subject to bright light. Direct and specular glare are two types of glare vision. Direct is the relatively bright light, while specular is reflected relatively bright light. So this is the direct would be caused by the sun during the day, and specular is uh, caused by some reflections. For example, if there is a signage that is being flashed by a source of light, and there is a possibility that it will have a glare that will be that there is a glare that will be produced by that reflective object. Pwede ring mirror during the day are some sources of specular glare. This causes decreased visibility and eye discomfort. Of course, if you try to look at the sun for a very long time, or even for a short time, it will cause a decrease of your visibility or decrease of your perception. But of course, it will recover after some time, and that is called glare recovery. The time required by a person to recover from the effects of glare. This is about 3 seconds moving from dark to light, and 6 seconds moving from light to dark. Last, we have the depth perception. This is the ability of a person to estimate speed and distance. Binocular vision and monocular parallax are some uh, descriptions. This is important on two-lane highways during passing maneuvers to prevent head-on crashes. The human eye is a poor estimator of speed, distance, size, and acceleration. because our eyes judge based on the relativity of uh, those objects near us. For example, if you are moving, you may perceive something that is moving at the same rate in the same direction as you as not moving, because it you are judging it based on the relativity of your positions. So this is caused really by the relative judgment of the human eye. You can also perceive a big object as being small if that is far from you, because we perceive objects that are big as small if they are far from us. For example, the sun, that is, we may perceive it as something, or the stars na lang. We may perceive it as something that is small, but then they are really bigger than some of the stars are really bigger than the earth. It's just that they are far from us. That is why they appear to be relatively smaller. And acceleration also is also one part, or one uh, parameter that is usually estimated poorly by the human eye due to the relative judgment. Standardization. So, one part ng standardization is for the vehicles. We place car speedometer for us to have a guide in knowing what is the speed of that vehicle that we are driving, because we have poor estimation of speed. Let's now move to the human visual factors applied to highway design. There are 5 propositions under this. As speed increases, visual concentration increases. These 5 are self-explanatory, so I will not be explaining them. As speed increases, the point of visual concentration recedes farther away. So as our speed increases, our concentration is on the farther objects, not on the uh, objects that are near us. As speed increases, peripheral vision diminishes. So this means that the peripheral vision, or the cone of peripheral vision, uh, the angle of the cone of peripheral vision decreases. So we usually focus na lang dun sa ating foreal cone of vision. As speed increases, foreground details begin to fade. As speed increases, space perception becomes impaired. So here are some propositions. Hearing and smelling, another human component besides feeling and seeing. So these are important to the driver and pedestrian. That is why it is important for us to prevent using headphones or earphones when we are using road transport, because we will have it will affect our judgment or our hearing abilities to detect a possible accident or a possible danger. Helpful in preventing collision. For the engine, you may hear, of course, the driver hears something when there is a different sound, when there is something wrong with the engine. You can also smell something. For example, if your car is overheating, you can smell uh, an odor. For the tires also, and for the sirens for hearing, for horns and bells and radios. Traffic sounds. So those are some important aspects on why hearing and smelling is part of the human component in that affects the use of road transport of humans. Now we move to perception reaction. So what is this? Perception first is the process of extracting necessary information from the environment, while perception reaction time is the interval between seeing, feeling or hearing a stimulus and making an initial response. So this is important for designing roads because we need to design it based on the uh, ability of the users, and that is humans. Example, the object becomes visible, the driver steps on the brake pedal. From the time that you see the danger, that is the start of the perception reaction time up to the time that you created your response or your action towards that perceived danger. PRT has been self-divided into four sub-processes, also known as PIEV times. That is perception time, identification time, emotion time, and volition time. We'll go over this on the next slides. And we'll start with perception time. Perception time is the time elapsed for the driver to see the object on the road. As you can see in the image here, the driver is here and there is an, a deer, I think, or a goat that is on the road. So the time that the driver sees that object or perceived obstruction in the road is the perception time. Next to that would be the identification or the intellection time, which is the time elapsed for the driver to identify the object and thus understand the stimulus. Of course, if you see some objects, at first you will not be able to identify it. There is a time that will elapse for you to be able to identify is what is that object that is on the way or that is serving as an obstruction. Next is the emotion or the decision time. This is the time elapsed for the driver to decide what action to take. So will the driver stop? Will the driver steer away from the obstruction? And volition is the reaction time, time elapsed for the driver to execute the action. So this is the decision and this is the execution of that specific decision. So perception reaction time occurs in somewhat a small time interval. That is why it's important for us to have our main concentration on the road that we are traversing and not be distracted by some other factors like our cell phones or other objects. Of course, this is not to avoid our perception reaction process. So going back here, this is a process which means that we need you start with perception, then you go to identification, the emotion or the decision time, and the volition or the reaction to that specific stimulus. Perception reaction time is an important factor in determining the braking distances. Minimum sight distance, yellow phase, or the signalized intersection, and this varies among individuals. That is why the human component really is a very complex part. It is affected by many other factors and varying among individuals. Some of those factors that affects these variations are age, tired or influence of drugs or alcohol, environmental conditions, expected or unexpected stimulus, especially when you are traversing a road in that is passing through a forest. Not really, because during those times, for example, dito, that place was originally a habitat for animals, right? So naturally, they will be crossing or they will be moving within that specific area. So, a question arises, sino ba talaga ang nagko-cross? Who is the one who is really crossing or is obstructing the way? Is it these animals or is it the people or the vehicles that is passing through this one? So, that is why it's very important for us to take care because that is the natural habitat of these animals. Sometimes they are unexpected because they're already there, uh, or they are hanging around in that specific road, or sometimes it is unexpected once they are running and there's a very limited time for you to identify that object. Then there will have a problem in the perception reaction time. You will have a lesser reaction or lesser time interval for you to be able to create that decision of stepping on the brake to prevent accidents and collisions, of course. According to Triggs and Harris, the 85th percentile to brake varied from 1.26 to over 3 seconds. And according to the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, or what we know as AASHTO, the recommended is 2.5 seconds for stopping sight distance, 90th percentile decision time, inadequate for complex or instantaneous decisions or unexpected or unusual maneuvers. Decision sight distance. We will be going over this sight distances in the next parts of module 3. Parts of perception. First part is perception delay, the time between visibility and point of perception. And we also have your perception interval, the time required to determine that there is a potential hazard. Of course, not everything that you see in the road are potential hazard. It's still up to your emotion or your decision or this perception interval to determine whether is that object is really a potential hazard. The elements of reaction time are reaction, which involves the analytical and decision-making portions of the driver's reaction process. And of course, the total reaction, which includes the reaction plus the actual control response or your action or towards that specific uh, stimulus. Driver strategy are varying. According to Van Strom and Kaples in 1971, in their 1971 study, they describe a simple driving task model useful in understanding the relationship between driving behavior and the possibility of anticipating a hazard. Driver performance is affected by is composed of decision, timing, location, or type of obstacle, and relative speed of the driver, and also the physical characteristics of the road between the driver and the object. So, yung friction ng road, for example, that is one physical characteristics of the road between the driver and the object. If there is greater friction, then it would be easier to uh, it will be easier to stop, for the vehicle to stop. While if the friction between the road and the wheels of the vehicle is lesser, then it will be harder for the vehicle to stop. And this is affected also by some environmental conditions. For example, the rain. Roads become slippery when it is raining. Decrease yung friction. So here is the driver strategy model that was given by Van Strom and Kaples in 1971. This is the vehicle. The distances 1, 2, 3 are described here. Distance 1 is the distance traversed because of perception. So here, this distance or between this distance, like perception occurs. For distance 2, the distance traversed during the time needed to decide. This is the emotion part. 3 is the distance during the reaction time. And The point T is the true point of no return, is in motion of hazard is also in motion. M is the mental point of the driver, is the last point at which action must be taken. So further after this point, there is this the distance between these points is very critical. You cannot really take an action after the point T. And A is the last point where the driver acts or begins to act. That is after the perception and the emotional or the decision part. So this is that specific point. This is for a driver that is not, of course, a driver that is not affected by some factors. For example, if you are drunk, then T or the point of no return will be at the very start, and you will have no time to decide. In that case, it will be very affected kapag sobrang drunk ng driver. So there, aside from uh the previous things that were discussed, there are also other human rules that are relevant to the highway system, and one of this is the pedestrian. So pedestrians, as I have told you, are those people that are using the road transport but then they are not using vehicles. In case of an accident, the pedestrian is the victim. Of course, there is no really no protection for the pedestrian. Well, for the car, there is the vehicle might take note of the word. It might uh, protect you from an accident in cases of collisions. For example, if a vehicle and the pedestrian will be undergoing collision, of course, the pedestrian will be the victim because uh, it has a lesser momentum as compared with the car, which has greater momentum. So if they will be colliding, then the pedestrian will have a greater damage. In US, 5,000 are killed and 70,000 are injured yearly. These are pedestrians. Pedestrian deaths account for about 11 to 13% of all motor vehicle deaths each year in the US. Crash involvement rate is highest for 5 to 9 years old. So children that are unattended will have a higher chance, of course, of being involved in crashes. 69% of fatalities were male, and pedestrian injury rate was 58% higher for males than for females. The rates for older people over 65 years old are lower than for most age groups. Why? Because yung older people, they are somewhat more uh, careful in a sense, siguro. Kaya yun yung rate ng accidents for older people are lower than for most age groups. Or hindi na rin sila, they do not go outside na rin that much, kaya lesser yung possibility that they will be meeting an accident as a pedestrian. Greater caution exercise and infrequence of walking near traffic. So we were right. Older pedestrians moving are more vulnerable to injury or death than younger pedestrians. Of course, if you are younger, then you will have a greater chance of surviving once you meet an accident or crash that is due to road accidents. Some causes of pedestrian accidents in the US are speeding, 31% of fatal crashes, 34% of pedestrian fatalities were DUI, and this is according to walkinginfo.org. So the graph here shows the fatalities based on speed of vehicle. Of course, if you have, as your speed increases, there is a greater percentage of fatalities that will be caused by that accident. Pedestrian characteristics are walking speeds is about zero point 0.9 to 2.4 meter per second, and the force that is affected by your age, by your stride or your pacing. So there are some factors. At intersections, males are have this speed 1.5 meter per second and females have 1.4. Of course, these are just some averages. Meron pa rin namang mga, this is not constant naman. This may change, of course. Design value is 1.22 meter per second. According to Rufil, average walking speeds depends on the population of elderly pedestrian. So if there are more elderly pedestrians, then they will have a lower lower rate or walking speed. 1.22 meter per second when elderly population is 20% and lower. That is for the design value, or the one that we use for designing the pedestrian lanes rather. 0.9 meter per second when elderly population are more than 20%. So elderly population is also considered in the design of intersections. Pedestrians influence the design and location of pedestrian facilities. Some of the pedestrian facilities are overpasses or pedestrian lanes, yung mga yun. Street walks. Some control devices are special pedestrian signals, safety zones and islands at intersections, pedestrian underpass, this is somewhat safer, elevated walkways, crosswalks, and traffic signals. So elevated walkways are, you can see this in Makati usually. Maraming elevated walkways in Makati. Blind pedestrian or those who have special needs, and we also design them we also consider them in the design of pedestrians. So here are some images for the pedestrian spatial ellipse when you're walking, sensory zone, the pacing zone. So those are being considered in the design. And another, besides drivers and pedestrians, we also have cyclists. So this is becoming more prevalent and are now an important component of the highway mode, especially during the pandemic. We have seen an increase in the use of cycling as a mode of transport in road transportation. Cyclist is not only the driver, provides power to move the bicycle. There are three classes of bicyclists according to AASHTO. They classified them into ABC. A are advanced cyclists, B less experienced cyclists, and C are children riding on their own or with parents. According to a study by Payne, the level terrain speeds are 32 km per hour for level terrain, and for downgrade speeds, of course, that will be greater. uh, 50 kph, and for upgrade speeds, of course, it's hard to go upward or uphill, yung sinasabi nila na paahon. That would be 13 kph average. Crossing an intersection from a stop position, about 13 kph with an acceleration of 1 meter per second. We also consider vehicle characteristics. How are vehicle characteristics important in the design of highway? One of the design or the characteristics that affect the design of highways are the tires. Their uh, the speed or the maximum speed that the vehicle can achieve, or in what time interval can they achieve that maximum speed. So those are some bases in highway design and traffic analysis. The length of the freeway acceleration and deceleration lanes are needed to be determined. Maximum highway grades, stopping sight distances, passing sight distances. Numerous accident prevention devices. Criteria are partly based on static, dynamic, and kinematic characteristics of vehicles. Static includes weight and size of vehicle. Of course, part na dyan yung aerodynamics ng vehicle. Sa dynamic, involves the forces that cause the motion of the vehicle. Kinematic involves the motion of vehicle without considering the forces that cause the motion. Design vehicle has characteristics that encompass those of nearly all vehicles expected to use the highway. So when designing based on the vehicle characteristics, we use the design vehicle, which is somewhat an a representative of all the vehicles that are expected to use the highway, because there are certain highways that are not designed for some vehicles. For example, they are not designed for trucks, mga ganun. Those are some considerations also. In the design of bridges, and yes, we consider those different vehicles characteristics, and we have different design vehicle that is being used in the analysis or in the design. AASHTO has selected 4 general classes of vehicles. Passenger cars. These are sport utility vehicles or minivans, vans and pickup trucks. We also have buses, trucks, and recreational vehicles, motorhomes, cars with computer trailers, and some other recreational vehicles. So these are some design vehicle dimensions from AASHTO. And some examples of different types of trucks. You can just go over this one. You have your minimum turning path for a single unit, this truck design vehicle, and for semi trailers. So those are being considered in the design of highways, of course. Static characteristics are established design standards for physical components of the highway, including lane width, the shoulder width, the length and width of parking bays, the length of vertical curves. So those are the ones that are being designed for static characteristics. We have here the table for the range of state limits on vehicle lengths by type and maximum weight of vehicle. You have here the allowable lengths and allowable weights. Static characteristics still. Expression for overall maximum gross weight for a group of two or more consecutive axles. So this is the formula that they use, where W is the overall gross weight, L is the extreme of any group of two or more consecutive axles, N is the number of axles in the group under consideration, and the gross load of 34,000 pounds may be carried by two consecutive sets of tandem axles if the overall distance between the first and last axles of the consecutive sets is 36 feet or more. So we will not be going over this. I just gave you a preview of this one. So a review of the concepts that were discussed in this video is that the independent interactions between the various components, such as the human component, which is composed of drivers, pedestrians, cyclists, and yeah, uh, you also have the vehicle component, you also have your road component, and the environmental components, which is creating a complex system in road transportation. The human component is the most complex part because there is really a great variation in the reaction perception, in the sensory abilities of different types of people. So for the next discussion, we will be going over the different sight distances that will be used in the design of our roads.